Hey Crossroads, I'm Joel, this is my friend Guy, and we are excited to be hosting this first community group guides. What you have in front of you are a number of different questions where you'll be able to interact with and learn from, and then hopefully be challenged as you move out from your groups. We pray God's rich encounter on you. What you're going to do next is begin just by reading Psalm 27 as a group together. So, Guy, our series is titled Get Desperate. And the word desperate has a whole bunch of different things that come to mind when you hear it. Sometimes positive, sometimes not as positive. Tell me what comes to your mind as you consider the word desperate.
It's the understanding of how desperation works within us, and we were chatting about this earlier, and it's how we get desperate. I was sharing with you that when I backslid, went away from the Lord, but then my sister-in-law asked me, when are you going to come back to God? And it was 4 years that I was away from the Lord for. And I said, when I'm desperate enough. Right. And I've always believed that God led me into a place of desperation. But as we talked about, that's might not be the case. It might be that God opened my eyes to see how desperate my situation was.
Right.
Because otherwise, if God doesn't open our eyes to our situation, the situation we're in, the situation we might be comfortable with, and helps us to see the desperation that we need to embody, then we don't move on from that.
Yeah, that's good. I think the idea behind getting desperate is this reality that no matter what, we all move into a place of desperation. We're all desperate for something, and that changes based on messages that we hear, whether it's messages from the world around us, messages from friends. There is something that we're desperate for. And what we know is that God gives us a clear understanding of what our desperation, what our drive needs to be towards.
I think what we need to, or what's good to look at, is the difference between desperation and, I think, fulfillment, satisfaction.
Yeah.
Is if it's hard to piece together, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's being dissatisfied with what the world offers, because the world wants us to be dissatisfied. The world wants us to find satisfaction in something, and so to keep us in a place of dissatisfaction is just what the marketing companies try and do. What we need to recognize as Christians, as followers of Jesus, is that should be channeled away from what the world has to offer, and see our satisfaction in Jesus.
Yeah, absolutely.
See our satisfaction,
yeah.
and direct that in the right way.
Yeah.
Or get a different perspective on it.
Yeah. And so in the message, we talked about this idea of a survival situation. We talked about a compass and having a bearing, in the idea of being able to follow it, and that your desperation, what your drive is focused. It's going in that direction, and that's what I hear you saying, is that as long as we're unclear or we're chasing after other things, we won't be fulfilled.
No.
But when our desperation goes after the one thing, that's when fulfillment comes.
So at the top of the page, on the sheet there, it does say, consider your life and your priorities. So what are the three main things that you're orienting your life around? And back in September, you talked about, if you're not sure what it is that your priorities are, have a look at your calendar. See what it is that you're spending your leisure time on. And then it'll give you a good idea of what your priorities are. So the next point we come to is in Psalm 27 and verse 4, David said, one thing I ask from the Lord, this only do I seek, that I may dwell in the house of the Lord all the days of my life, to gaze on the beauty of the Lord and to seek him in his temple.
Yeah, and I think that's the one thing that we're talking about here. That's the one thing that we are really going after. And David understood it, right? Even in the Old Testament, David got that the one thing of importance was God, was his presence. It's interesting because in 1 Corinthians 6, Paul says this, do you not know that your body is a temple of the Holy Spirit, who is in you, whom you have received from God? And so that one thing that David was really going after is now the one thing that we actually have. And so you and I were talking earlier, Guy, just about the difference between Old Testament and New Testament. Do you want to just share a little bit about that dialogue? What do you see as one of the Old Testament themes, and now where we're at in the New Testament?
With the Old Testament, there was an awful lot emphasis put on seeking after God, doing the right things, seeking his approval, trying to sacrifice and ritual cleansing, whereas the Old Testament is more of in line with our vision in Crossroads here, and that's of pursue an encounter, being pursued by God. Now through Jesus, we see our rightful or our honoured place, really, on how precious we are in God and how God seeks after us. There is a point at which we can become complacent with that and tend to think that it's all about us, which I think is for another or a further conversation, I think.
Yeah, I agree wholeheartedly. So David essentially had to go to the temple, and it says that he wanted to go to the temple to gaze on the beauty of the Lord, where Paul says that we are the temple of the Lord, which means that we have the beauty of God within us. So what does that mean? How does that impact and shape the way that we pursue? How does that shape the way that we, in desperation and urgency, go after the one thing? Go ahead and discuss that in your groups. So we keep driving on this idea of getting desperate, of this importance of the one thing, right? And so Matthew 6:33, Jesus is talking and he says this, seek first his kingdom, God's kingdom, seek first his righteousness, and all these things will be given to you as well. And so Jesus lived oriented towards the one thing, right? And the context that he's talking about these things is in the midst of worry about what you're going to eat, drink, any of those things, what you're going to wear. Keep your focus on the one thing. What comes to mind as I'm talking about worries and
well, those are the things that distract us. Those are the things that Satan uses to distract us from. You say the one thing. I think the one thing could be even interpreted as the thing that satisfies us,
right.
as draws us into a life that's fulfilling, isn't it?
Right, the only thing that can satisfy.
Yeah.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, and that's our own calling.
Yeah.
In a sense, you were saying that Jesus was oriented towards that one thing, and that was his calling.
That's right.
His purpose in life, and hopefully, through this series and through this whole movement in this direction, we'll start to discover what ours is in this. But coming back to this worry, and the fear, and we spoke on it when we did that 3-course meal sermon that we did back along with the three of us.
That's right.
Spoke.
No fear, and I think that's a theme for us this year. Actually, is the idea of not being afraid. God's got it. Don't be afraid. Yeah.
And I think the problem that we see often. And I was listening to The Shack, the audio version of The Shack, and I was listening to it while I was working away. And in it, God was having a conversation with the character in there, Mac, and he was talking about worries and fears. And in there, he says, the problem that you have with these worries, the problem you have is that you just don't see me there with you. When we start to see God with us in those situations that most of the time we forecast on how it's going to look, we don't put God in that. I think that's something worth unpacking more in your groups, hopefully.
That's right. So in your groups, just take a moment right now and discuss some of the worries that you face and consider what it looks like to be aware of the one thing, to be aware of God's presence, His nearness in the midst of those worries. So at age 12, Jesus had gone with his parents to Jerusalem to this festival, and it was time for them to go, and Joseph and Mary and everybody left, and then days later realized Jesus wasn't with them, right? Have you ever done that? Have you ever forgotten your kids for a few days?
Not a few days, no. Maybe for half an hour or so, but not a few days. We don't live in that kind of community anymore.
No, we don't. We don't. And so this is what Jesus said when he was being chastised, corrected. In Luke 2:49, he says, "Why did you seek me? Did you not know that I must be about my Father's business?" And so Jesus understood, right? And it's interesting because this is in the context. He's at the temple, but he understood that the one thing was to seek out God's presence, was to be driving and looking for that. And that set him on a course, that gave him a confidence, right? You're going to share with us a quote from Spurgeon. Tell us, frame it for us just a little bit.
It's just when Jesus knew exactly where he was going, where he was heading, what his purpose was, everything else pales. We talk about the fear of man, don't we?
Yeah.
We mentioned how the fear of man is a trap.
Yeah.
Spurgeon said, "Let a man believe that God has set him to do a particular work, and you may sneer at him, what cares he? He would give as much for your sneer as he would for your smile, and that is nothing at all. He believes God intends him to do the work. You say nay, but he never asks you for your vote upon the question. He has received God's message as he thinks, and he goes on, and you cannot resist him." In that quote, Spurgeon's talking about a man who's fully focused on his goal, as I imagine Spurgeon was. And I don't think there's anything that could have slowed him down. If you can get that kind of mindset, then we can, where would that lead us?
Yeah.
How far would we go with that kind of mindset where we don't really care much what people think?
Yeah.
And he says here, he never asked you for your vote.
That's right. That's right. And so I think that is that there's something here that's essential for us to understand, because we'll hear Jesus say that I was about my Father's business, and then we'll go, well, we need to be like Jesus and be about the Father's business, which is right, but none of us are called to do what Jesus did.
No.
Jesus did it. He's already done that. And really, what we're called to do is in whatever place we're at, whatever job we have, whatever role we have, within that role is where we're called to the one thing, and that is to seek God's presence and to live into the fullness of that position or that role. Every single person, every single human being is equally valued by God, right? We're on
Absolutely.
the same page there.
Yes, for sure.
When we come into relationship with God, when we say, Jesus, we need you, and we speak it out, we believe it in our hearts, that's when God's Spirit lives within us. And so the temple that was outside and looking is now inside, and now we have the one thing, which means wherever we go,
goes with us.
whatever it goes with us. God goes with us, right? And so it shatters the idea that the only place of service, the only place of mission, the only place of value is within the church. There's value in those roles, but there's equal value as we're living to the fullness of who God's created to be. Whether that's as a teacher, whether that's working a trade, whether that's serving in one of the hospitality. Every single person has this essential call to get desperate after the one thing. And so the question that we want for you to discuss in your groups is, what does being about the Father's business look like in your life?
So we started this evening, this guide, talking about what is our lives, what is our life oriented around, what is our priorities, looking at our calendar, seeing what it is that distracts us from seeking that one thing, being desperate for more of God. And so the question we want to leave you with really is, have a look. See what it is that's distracting you. Is it Netflix? Is it the TV? Is it Facebook? Is it something that's drawing you away, something that gains your interest more? And then have a look at those things and then make a commitment to yourself. Because that's what we're doing here, is we're changing the direction of the way that we're heading and trying heading in the right direction and get ourselves and our bearings straight. So have a look and see where you commit to doing one thing this week to change your orientation, to change the direction in which you're heading.
Crossroads Community Groups, we are so glad that you joined us and we're able to move through this first session of Get Desperate. We're excited about what God has in store for us. Right now, what you're going to do in your groups is spend a bit of time praying, and your group leaders are going to give you some direction around that. If you want to get ahead and start thinking about where we're at next week, we're going to be in 1 Samuel, the first chapter, just looking at Hannah and the model that she is for us. Have an amazing week.